Hello, dear friends. Today we continue to penetrate, understand, read this chapter, the next chapter of the wonderful book, What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind, which is actually an interview by Susan Moon and Norman Fischer. And a week ago I had to stop in midst of a chapter which is the longest of this book. The chapter is called Stages of Practice. Beautiful, very beautiful. Every chapter very important for me to understand things deeper, although I had already really marked it. so many sentences marked. And I fear this will not be the last time that I read it. But reading loudly, as we know from our childhood times, when hopefully our mothers or grandmothers or grandfathers had written fairy tales to us, is just another thing. It goes directly, it speaks directly to the soul if it is read from a place of wholeheartedness and love. Then it reaches the other person or persons in their wholeheartedness, in their most receptive mind. So let's start. If you have the book, I'm really starting with the first line on page 121. Cannot really believe that I have read so much until today, but I have started in January. Just a short remark. I do not start with the meditation. It makes no sense. I kept the habit, the good habit, the healthy habit, to sit before reading until last time, but I think it in this format it seems exaggerated for me. So everybody who wants to sit before listening should do this, and I think it's really absolutely better in terms of this receptive mind and open-mindedness, but it must not be included into these humble recordings. The question of priests brings up historical and social dimensions that also have to be taken into account. We are not living in ancient India or Japan. Our history has had a traumatic past in relation to priests and religious hierarchy. In Europe, the church and its clergy were for centuries a source of psychological and social oppression, though at the same time a place of scholarship, art, culture, and often comfort for ordinary people. The French Revolution was as much a revolt against the church as it was against the nobility. The United States were founded by European settlers fleeing religious persecution. In brackets, though some of them were for their own part just as intolerant of others' religious commitments. Leftist politics has a deep sense at its heart that religion is nothing more than a mechanism for keeping the masses quiet, as Marx felt. And the opposition of Western religious establishment to scientific and social progress over the last several hundred years still continues in some cases. So yes, we are happy to practice meditation or Zen because it is individualistic and egalitarian, good for us, inexpensive, non-habit forming, and doesn't require beliefs or guilt or obligation. But as soon as we see that there are priests, robes, and incense involved, we may become gun-shy or deeply embedded but possibly unconscious cultural prejudices against priests having been awakened. In addition to all this, many come to practice Zen in flight from their own religious backgrounds that include scary or oppressive clergy people and much unhelpful ritual or dogma. So finding all this in Zen can raise hackles. Some of the newer Zen lineage never had priests and never wanted them, because they consider the priestly institution archaic and counterproductive. Others' lineages had priest status at one time and more or less dropped it because of perceived abuses not in the distant but in the recent past. But as far as I'm aware, all the Zen lineages have empowered teachers and have the Jukai ritual. So there are still distinctions made and still, in effect, priests without the robes. Yes, as you say, it is a firm Zen notion that all beings without exception have Buddha nature, or as Dogen put it, are Buddha nature. This is the first point, the main point, and perhaps the only point. All distinctions between practitioners, or even practitioners and non-practitioners, must be seen against this backdrop. As soon as we lose track of this, we are sunk. But if we can keep it in mind at all times, we can perhaps make use of these traditional distinctions for the good. Susan answers her next question. Susan Moon Sensei. And why would a person choose to become a priest? Norman Roshi answers. Earlier I said that a person's reasons for becoming a priest may not be so clear. Suzuki Roshi once said to his Western students, "You are neither priests nor lay people." Once he was asked, "What is a priest?" And he replied, "I don't know." A response my own teacher loves to quote whenever he is asked to define what a priest is. Given this from our revered founder, it is no wonder that there is some murkiness around the question of what a priest is or who should be one. Usually when people in our lineage family discuss these matters, the discussion is long, deep, and very personal. Deciding to become a priest is a matter of one's inmost religious feeling, something not always easy to define. Someone who decides to be a priest is likely to be a person who finds all the usual identities in his or her life to be insufficient responses to the largest human questions. Why live? Who am I? For such a person, it isn't enough to be a man, woman, husband, wife, father, mother, practitioner of an art or profession. Though the person may have many of these things in his or her life and may value them, somehow the inner commitment to throw away all other identities and to remain simple, a disciple of Buddha, wearing Buddha's clothes, eating from Buddha's bowls, lifetime after lifetime, practicing the way for oneself and others, seeing that there is not and could never be a distinction between self and others, for one who ordains as a priest, somehow all this, vague as it may seem in any ordinary practical sense, is the only way that life can make any sense. However, I doubt that most people who decide to become priests would put it quite like that. Maybe they would simply say they want to be a priest, that this is their heart's desire, that they have a deep feeling of urgency about wanting to ordain. Maybe they have been affected by and deeply admire someone who is or was a priest and feel a need to emulate that person by ordaining. Maybe they feel some unnameable human pain that they believe can be healed only by ordaining as a priest. Hard to say, hard to discern, and at the same time sometimes not so hard. Sometimes a person seems to be a priest already even before ordaining. This is the usual advice Sojun, my teacher, gives when someone approaches him for ordination. He tells the person not to wait for the ceremony, to start immediately living like a priest inside. Next question by Susan Moon. Isn't the wave of the future of Zen in the West toward lay practice? Most people who are interested in Zen want to keep on living in the world. The monastic way of life isn't part of our cultural tradition. Why not forget about sewing those complicated okezas? Why would you want to set yourself apart from ordinary people by wearing strange clothes and walking around with a bare scalp? What about the saying, every mind is the way? Norman Fischer is answering, well, you have a point. American Zen is certainly a lay movement. In Asia, lay practice has traditionally been to give alms and support temples and leave the deeper religious practices to the monastics. But here in the West, we are interested in the practice that monastics have always done: meditation, experiential wisdom study, and we feel we can do it as lay people. This is a radical departure, but one that seems to follow the tenor of our times. My guess is that some Asian Buddhists find this inspiring, while others perhaps find it odd or even foolhardy. But I'm sure that support for this kind of lay practice is a path for Western Buddhism is universal as, I will repeat this sentence. But I'm sure that support for this kind of lay practice as a path for Western Buddhism is universal among practitioners here, priest or lay. I don't think anyone in the West wants to exclude lay people from the primary practice. There are, as I have said, many lay centers, and even the monasteries are generally mainly populated by lay students in relatively short-term residence. So the question is, given this, is there any use at all in a Buddhist clergy? Certainly there is for people who want to be celibate and dedicate their lives to practice. This more traditional path of practice should be available for those who want to pursue it, and they will join lineages: Theravada, Chan, Tian, Zeon, Tibetan, that have the traditional celibate rule. Japanese Zen doesn't. So what about the Zen lineages? Should we have priests at all? Actually, I think the question is, should we have ritual? If not, then we don't need priests. But as I've said, ritual is powerful and important for the practice. And if we have ritual, then we will need people who study and lead ritual. We will need priests of some sort. You might say, well, how about dropping the complication of the okeza and having lay people be able to do all the things that priests do? Of course, that's possible, but then those lay people would function more or less as priests. And if you are going to have ritual and people who lead ritual, then why not give those people more, rather than less, traditional background and support? Ritual is an area in which efficiency isn't always the best thing. The ritual that you and I work out today and perform tomorrow can be joyful, creative and meaningful. But the ritual that has a long tradition behind it and that we have prepared for by our performance of other rituals over time will have an additional dimension to it. The priest ordination ceremony, for instance, which we've translated from the Japanese, contains words and gestures that are many centuries old and have been repeated by sincere practitioners for generations. When we do the ceremony, say the words, and perform the gestures, we feel all that, and it adds a great deal to our experience, not only at that moment, but afterwards. The question you are raising is really, how much ritual is too much? Where do we draw the line? Because ritual can be overdone. But I find a lot of meaning and benefit in the rituals we practice now and would not want to eliminate any of them. I would need a stronger reason for doing that than preference or convenience. Susan? So I ask again, what about everyday mind? Norman. Yes, all this seems very far from everyday mind, but maybe not as far as you might think. In Zen, the phrase everyday mind is first found in the famous dialogue between Nan Chuan and Zhao Zhu. Zhao Zhu asked, "What is the way?" This is the same question we began this book with. What is Zen? Nan Chuan, his teacher, replied, "Everyday mind is the way." Zhao Zhu said, "If everyday mind is already the way, how can I know it? How can I aim for it?" Nan Chuan said, "It's not a matter of knowing or not knowing. Knowing is an exaggeration. Not knowing is stupidity. The way is vast and wide. What does this have to do with knowing or not knowing?" Vast and wide. Usually we don't think of everyday mind, everyday activity as being vast and wide. Usually we think we know what is going on. But do we? Or maybe, as Nan Xuan implies, we valorize not knowing, a kind of romantic anti-intellectualism, as the true Zen. But ordinary mind, ordinary life is larger than either of these. Vast and wide, beyond anything we can know or understand completely, yet including within it all that we know and understand. Nan Chuan is saying that our lives, our concrete, ordinary, everyday lives, are already enlightenment. We don't need to look past them for some big metaphysical insights. If we could just actually be our lives rather than try to control them, maybe we could appreciate them. I had a big insight about everyday life when I was a student at Tassajara Monastery. I was there with my wife, Kathy, and our twin sons, Aaron and Noah, who at that time were about 9 months old. Kathy and I shared the monastic schedule equally, so half the time she was in the meditation hall and I was with the children, the only adult within a radius of 20 miles or so who was not in the meditation hall. Tassajara is very remote. I was feeling sorry for myself one day, thinking I was missing the important Zen lecture, when it occurred to me in a sudden flash of aha insight that if the teachings actually meant what they said, then right now, as I was feeding my sons in the wheelbarrow, they were impossibly rambunctious and messy when they ate. In the wheelbarrow they had to stay put, and I could hose out the wheelbarrow when they were finished. At this very moment of feeding them, this was my Zen lecture. If the teachings were true, this must be so. From that moment on, I never again felt sorry for myself. And from then on, my approach to practice was always grounded in everyday life. It had to be. Had I persisted in idealistic and fancy idea of Zen, I would never have been able to survive my life. Susan is asking, there are places in the West where a Zen student can go on a long retreat. I went to a practice period at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, deep in the mountains of Northern California, the same place where you fed your kids in the wheelbarrow, and I lived as a monk for 3 months, devoting myself totally to the Dharma and following the schedule religiously, if I may use that word. The experience gave me a kind of faith in my own Buddha nature. Is it important for all Zen students to have the experience of going on retreat from the world? Norman's answer: there is something about Zen that you can only fully appreciate when you have had the chance to do a residential practice period, several if possible. But a Zen practice period isn't exactly a retreat. In most contemplative traditions, the experience of retreat is crucial. What we call retreat usually means literally retreating from your normal everyday life and spending a period of time, a week, a month, or 2 or 3 months, in silent meditation, suspending all normal activity. Usually such retreats will produce powerful meditation experiences. In Zen, such intense silent meditation retreats are called sesshin, a word that means something like gathering or unifying the mind. Actually, a sesshin is considered more in advance than a retreat. The theory is you are going more intensely into the essence of your everyday life, not retreating from it. A classical sesshin is 7 days long. Sesshins are very important in Zen, essential probably. The Zen practice period that you are describing is something different. It is usually longer than a sesshin. 3 months is the classical length, and its model is not silent retreat. It's everyday monastic life that includes not only daily meditation, but also work, study, discussion, Buddhist services, and so on. The key to Zen practice, as expressed in the everyday mind story of Chao Chu and Nan Chuan, is the integration of intense meditation into everyday activities, so that you can feel how vast and wide such activities really are, rather than withdrawal from everyday activities in order to meditate. This is why practice period, not retreat per se, is so much prized in Zen. In a typical Japanese Soto Zen monastery, monks spend as much time doing ceremonies and working, and especially cleaning, as they do meditating. Susan, how can you call this everyday life? This certainly isn't my everyday life. The practice period was profound for me precisely because it wasn't my everyday life. Did I miss the point? Norman is answering. Right. Practice period isn't like your everyday life or the everyday lives of most contemporary people, but it is more like everyday life than a meditation retreat. In practice period there is talking, there is interaction, work, laundry, housekeeping. There are human problems. You are constantly having to switch activities. 1 minute meditating, then changing out of your robes into work clothes, then the bell rings and you change again to return to the meditation hall for the formal meal. As the days and weeks and months of practice period roll on, you begin to lose the sense that there is much difference between these various activities. It all becomes a blur. One seamless life, one continuous present moment of being alive. Vast and wide at all points. So even though practice period certainly feels like a quiet retreat compared to busy contemporary life, in fact what you are learning in practice period is how to live all the activities of your life in the spirit of the practice. If everyday life is a busy and stressful slog for you, a silent meditation retreat can feel like a respite, a relief. Then you have to step back into the impossible grind again. But for a Zen student, at least this is what the practice is meant to foster, ordinary life, even if very busy, and meditation are experienced as different modes of one thing. Different of course, but basically the same. I know many people who, having done a number of practice periods, live their lives in this way, with this understanding and attitude. This is not to say that they feel no stress or strain, but to them life seems like one long moment after moment, challenging and often joyful spiritual practice. I suspect that when you say the experience gave me a kind of faith in my own Buddha nature, this is what you mean. Susan asks, the next question. What about the sincere practitioners who really can take time off to do as a residential practice period? Norman. Yes, that's true of most people in our practice groups and probably most Zen practitioners these days who have families and careers doing useful work. For them, it might not be practical or possible to do a 3-month residential practice period. I've been finding that if people do sessions once a year, do daily practice at home or at a center, stay in touch with teachers and Sangha, they do begin little by little to live a Zen life, even without doing residential practice periods. In recent decades, many lay Zen practice places that do not have the opportunity for a residential practice period have begun to apply the classical template of practice period to ordinary lay practice. A special period of time is designated, a month or usually several months, during which practitioners come to the temple for special rituals and other events and commit themselves to extra meditation at home and various kinds of mutual practice support while carrying on with their ordinary lives. This is by no means the same as a residential monastic practice period, but it is becoming a new and effective form of Zen practice nevertheless. Susan. I have sometimes imagined becoming a monk and living long-term at a place like Tassajara or Green Gulch Farm, but perhaps the impulse comes from the desire to escape the complications and ambiguities of the world. I could spend my days sitting in silence, sifting incense and weeding the garden. I wouldn't have to look for a job, pay rent, or make any big decisions. I'd be living in community, so I wouldn't ever be lonely. This is what my life was really like during my 3 months at Tassajara. Could monastic residential practice be a form of escapism? The answer by Roshi. Yes, going to live in a monastery for a long time could be an escape. Maybe there are things you need to face that you can only face by dealing with your circumstances as they are in the ordinary world we live in, and avoiding that by entering a monastery might just be the easy way out. For some people in monasteries it is like that. Elders in those monasteries will gently try to help a person see this and support him or her to eventually face what needs to be faced. But sometimes that in-between time, that temporary escape, helps a person prepare him or herself for the challenges ahead. When this is so, and I've seen it many times, escaping to a monastery for a while is fruitful and positive. But there is another way to see this. Maybe escaping to a monastery takes more courage than remaining in the world. Remaining in the world is at least a known and accepted path. Leaving the world to practice silence and simplicity for an extended period of time is quite countercultural. Surrendering yourself to a monastic rule in a place where you can't retreat and can't run away and where the conditions might not be so easy may take some vision and courage. So let me have a drink. So we have left 2.5 pages. From one point of view, the world seems a given. It is where we live, and we are responsible for it. But from another point of view, the world is pretty crazy, pretty destructive. We could start with the daily violence, the wars, the horrible injustice. Every day women are raped, children abused, people are starving to death, while other people are sailing in yachts with a dozen crew members on permanent retainer. Anyone who remains in this world is in some sense supporting all this, keeping it going, functioning as a cog in its grinding wheel. And beyond this, there is the simple soul-crushing everyday stress and strain of contemporary life, commuting, working at what might be a meaningless or even a destructive job, paying bills and keeping up the house and garden, and appearances in general. All the boring and counterproductive productive activity the average person has to engage in to keep life afloat. Activity that prevents deep insight, deep feeling, and any stronger sense of reality than survival and conformity. For millennia, people who have seen the horror, injustice, boredom, and uselessness of the world have felt they had no choice but to drop out to live a life apart. A life of, as you say, purity and community, probably praying for the world, maybe caring about it deeply, but not lending their own support to its madness. Dropping out may be the ultimate gesture of protest. In ages gone by, dropouts often became monastics. Every culture has had them. For the last couple hundred years, artists have joined the ranks of the dropouts. Many contemporary artists, by no means all, see themselves as having abandoned this crazy world for a world of the imaginative, a world of protest and critique, beauty and meaning, a world apart. Remember Timothy Leary's great battle cry of a generation or two ago. Tune in, turn on, drop out. Get out of this false world and join a true one, where there can be some genuine encounter and some genuine fun. Leary never mentioned what one would do once one dropped out, but in fact alternatives were created and still are being created. Among them was the establishment of Zen monasteries in America. Having read this, you might think this is my point of view, that the world is a terrible, destructive, boring place that you should flee from as soon as possible. In part, I do see the world like this. Otherwise, I guess I would not have spent my life as I have. On the other hand, I also love the world, just as it is and also as it could be, and don't want to escape from it. I find this world immensely interesting and moving in a million ways. Of course, the world is full of problems and challenges, but it is the only world we've got. It's the one we've made over the millennia, and it is deeply satisfying to live in it and try to be of service. In any case, what I'm trying to say here is that perhaps escaping this life in the world to live in peaceful community, consuming few resources, and living a life of harmlessness isn't such a bad idea. Maybe it isn't irresponsible, maybe it isn't cowardly. If monastic life is a life of escapism, maybe more people should escape. But in Zen, monastic life has never been conceived of as an escape from the world. It is a place to investigate life and to prepare for a life of further engagement. In old China, monks traveled from monastery to monastery in order to visit teachers and improve their understanding of and appreciation of the teaching. Their goal was to be able to share the teaching and the blessing, either by helping to train others in monasteries or as residents of temples and towns where they might be of benefit to others. This is certainly the case with American Zen monasteries. To spend 2 or 3 or 4 years in a monastery is considered a long time. People who spend decades are few, and those people generally become responsible in one way or another for running those monasteries so that others can make use of them. So long-term monastics are not escaping the world. They are providing the world with necessary shelter, teaching and inspiration. They are providing a place where all kinds of people, in all kinds of ways, can seek spiritual renewal and refreshment. Tassajara, like all other Zen monasteries in America that I'm aware of, is an open place. Anyone can apply to spend a long or a short time there as a monastic, and during the spring and summer months, programs are offered to the public so that people with busy lives can come to the monastery to do yoga, study teachings, learn and cooking, or some other useful skill, or just rest. During these months, as are the Zen talks. I believe that monasteries are essential institutions for healthy societies. It's too bad there aren't more of them. My bow goes to you, the listeners whose name I'm seeing here, Jeff Chartrand and Robert Marks, wonderful, hello. And those who probably perhaps find my other chapters read on my website, www.winkelmann-seminare.de for Deutschland. Or you decide to buy that book, What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind. I can just praise it. It is really, really one of the best, or the best, really. I could deliver several reasons why I increasingly find that. One of the best arguments is that it is written in the own voices of both friends and student and teacher. Susan Moon is a student, or was a student of Norman, but also a long-term friend. And if you want to drop in this afternoon, this morning, if you come from America, this morning into the one-day sit of Everyday Zen, then go to their page, which is www.everydayzen.org, and you will find, I hope, the announcement of the one-day sit, which is starting at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So in Germany it is starting at 6 in the afternoon, which will be in a good hour. And so I have to prepare myself to eat something to kind of clear myself up and prepare for a wonderful sit, hopefully until 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning when it is ending, because I also really appreciate the service part. So let me thank you again. Perhaps you are curious which chapters will be still read, and I hope every Saturday afternoon. It is Over the Long Haul, Sangha, Everyday Life at Everyday Relationships, Zen and Art, and last not least, Saving All Sentient Beings, which I think is our vow, and I hope to contribute, or to have contributed to this vow, saving all sentient beings.